The door to Elite Jiu-Jitsu Academy creaked open, letting in a rush of cool autumn air along with an unlikely visitor. The clock on the wall read 6:30 p.m., prime training time when the mats were usually packed with the after-work crowd. Heads turned as a small gray-haired woman stepped inside, her hands clutching the strap of a modest gym bag. At 72 years old, Martha Chen stood just over 5 feet tall, with a slight frame that seemed almost fragile beneath her neatly pressed tracksuit. The bustling academy momentarily fell silent. 20 pairs of eyes, mostly belonging to muscular men in their 20s and 30s, watched as Martha cautiously approached the front desk. A few whispers rippled through the room, followed by poorly concealed smirks. "Can I help you?" asked the young woman at the reception desk. Her name tag read Lily, and she wore the blue belt that marked her as an intermediate student. Her eyes darted between Martha and the class currently drilling takedowns on the mats. Clearly confused about why someone who looked more suited for a knitting circle had wandered into one of the city's most competitive jiu-jitsu schools. Martha cleared her throat. "Yes, please. I'd like to ask about joining the beginners class." Her voice was soft but clear, carrying the faint traces of her Taiwanese accent even after 50 years in America. Lily blinked twice. "The beginners class? For yourself?" "Yes, for myself." Martha smiled patiently, used to this reaction. Since losing her husband of 45 years just 6 months ago, she'd grown accustomed to people's surprise when she ventured outside her expected routines. From across the room, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s detached himself from the group he was supervising and walked over. Coach Pete Davis had the weathered look of someone who had spent decades on the mats, cauliflower ears, fingers slightly bent from old breaks, and the confident walk of a predator. "I'm the head instructor here," he said, extending a hand that engulfed Martha's when she shook it. "Pete Davis, what can I do for you?" "I'm Martha Chen. I'm interested in learning jiu-jitsu." She stood a little straighter, meeting his evaluating gaze directly. Pete's face remained professional, but Martha caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the same look the doctor gave her when she refused stronger pain medication for her arthritis, preferring to manage it through movement and traditional remedies. "Have you ever done any martial arts before?" Pete asked, his tone measured. Martha hesitated. The truth was complex. In her youth back in Taipei, she had been something of a prodigy in judo, winning regional competitions before meeting her husband and moving to America in her 20s. But that had been half a century ago. The medals and trophies were packed away in boxes her grandchildren occasionally asked about. Instead of mentioning this, she simply said, "I practiced some Tai Chi over the years. For health, it wasn't a lie." Tai Chi had been her constant companion, practiced every morning in the park near her apartment, maintaining the flexibility and balance that had surprised her doctor during her last checkup. Pete nodded, seeming relieved at finding a martial arts connection, however tenuous. "Tai Chi is good for balance, but jiu-jitsu is very different. Very physical, very close contact. Lots of falling, rolling, sometimes it gets rough." As he spoke, a muffled laugh came from a group of young men who had stopped their drilling to watch the exchange. One of them, a tall, powerfully built man with a black belt tied around his waist, didn't bother hiding his amusement. Martha pretended not to notice. "I understand. I've watched some videos online. It seems interesting." What she didn't say was how the movements had awakened something in her, reminding her of the feeling of working with an opponent's energy rather than against it, principles shared by both judo and jiu-jitsu. She didn't mention how she'd spend hours watching instructional videos after dinner, her fingers occasionally moving through phantom grips and positions. Pete scratched his neck, clearly torn between the gym's inclusive public stance and his private concerns. "Well, we do have a senior self-defense workshop once a month, which might be more appropriate." "I'd prefer the regular classes," Martha interrupted gently but firmly. "If that's all right, I can sign any waiver you need." The snickering from the corner grew slightly louder. The black belt whispered something to his training partner, who tried to suppress a laugh and failed. Pete shot them a warning look before turning back to Martha. "Tell you what, why don't you observe today's beginner class? It starts in 30 minutes. Then you can make an informed decision." Martha nodded, grateful for the small victory. "Thank you. That would be perfect." Pete showed her to a bench along the wall, then returned to his advanced class. Martha sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, watching the students drill techniques with intensity. She noted the way they moved, the principles of leverage and timing that seemed so familiar yet distant, like a language she once spoke fluently but had forgotten through years of disuse. On the mats, the black belt who had laughed was now demonstrating a sweep on his partner, moving with impressive technical precision, despite his obvious strength. He caught Martha watching and held her gaze for a moment, his expression a mixture of amusement and dismissal. Martha looked away first, focusing instead on the framed photos that lined the walls. Competitors holding trophies, group pictures from tournaments, newspaper clippings celebrating the Academy's achievements. The energy of the place was palpable, charged with effort and ambition. As the advanced class wound down, students from the beginner class began filtering in. Most were in their 20s, a mix of men and women with white belts tied inexpertly around their waists. They, too, glanced curiously at Martha before starting their warm-up jogs around the mat. An older man, though still at least 20 years younger than Martha, approached the bench and sat down heavily beside her, breathing hard from the warm-up. "First time?" he asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. Martha nodded. "Yes, just watching today." "Tom Wong," he said, offering a hand. "Been at it 4 months now. Hardest thing I've ever done, and I ran 2 marathons back in my 50s. "Martha Chen, it looks challenging." Tom laughed. "That's putting it mildly. My kids think I'm having a midlife crisis at 62. "I probably am." He nodded toward the mat. "Fair warning, it's humbling. Really humbling. Especially when teenagers half your size tie you into knots." Martha smiled, appreciating his friendliness. "Sometimes being humble is good for us." "True enough. You thinking of joining?" Before she could answer, Pete called the beginners to gather around for the technique demonstration. Tom excused himself, leaving Martha alone on the bench again. For the next hour, she watched intently as the class learned a basic guard pass. The movements awakened distant memories, the feel of a training partner's weight, the subtle shift of balance that could turn defense into attack. Her fingers occasionally twitched, muscle memory trying to engage after decades of dormancy. What nobody in the room could see was the slideshow playing in Martha's mind. Training in a modest dojo in Taipei, the feel of a judogi stiff with dried sweat, her coach's stern voice pushing her to perfect her foot sweeps. She had been known for her ashiwaza, her exceptional timing allowing her to off-balance opponents twice her size with seemingly minimal effort. As the class paired up to practice, Martha noticed one young woman struggling with the technique, her frustration evident as her partner repeatedly blocked her attempts to pass. Without thinking, Martha's hands mirrored the movement in her lap, making the small adjustment that would have made the difference. After class, while students rolled up the mats, Pete approached her again. "So what do you think? Still interested?" Martha stood, smoothing her tracksuit. "Yes, I am. When can I start?" Pete seemed surprised by her determination. "We have all new students fill out some paperwork and a health waiver. Given your—" He paused, searching for a diplomatic word, experience level. "We'd also recommend a doctor's note clearing you for physical activity." From nearby, the black belt who had laughed earlier overheard the conversation. He was gathering his gear, shaking his head slightly. "Are you sure this is the right hobby for you?" Pete asked, lowering his voice. "It can be pretty rough, especially at the beginning." Martha met his gaze steadily. "I need something challenging, Mr. Davis. Since my husband passed, my days have been too quiet, too empty." She didn't add that her 4 grandchildren had suggested gentler hobbies, painting classes, book clubs, even bird watching. None had sparked any interest in her. Something in her quiet dignity seemed to reach Pete. He nodded slowly. "Okay then, let's get you set up with the paperwork. First class can be tomorrow evening if you want. But take it slow, all right? No shame in tapping early and often." As Martha followed Pete to the office, she passed by the black belt, who was now zipping up his gym bag. He didn't bother lowering his voice as he spoke to his training partner. "This should be interesting. Hope we have extra ice packs." Martha pretended not to hear, but as she signed the membership forms, a small, determined smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. She'd been underestimated her entire life, as an immigrant, as a woman, and now as a senior citizen. The feeling was nothing new. What no one at Elite Jiu-Jitsu Academy knew was that underneath her unassuming exterior, a competitor still lived, and she had never been one to back down from a challenge. Martha arrived for her first actual training session 15 minutes early, her new white GI neatly folded in her bag. She'd ordered it online the same night after signing up, paying extra for overnight delivery. The crisp cotton felt strange in her hands after so many years, different from her old judogi, yet familiar in ways that stirred long, dormant memories. The changing room was empty when she arrived. Martha changed slowly, her fingers working deliberately as she folded her street clothes and put on the GI pants and jacket. Her body bore the marks of her 72 years, the cesarean scar from her second child, the slight stoop in her shoulders, the sunspots on her hands. But beneath the signs of age was a frame that had remained surprisingly strong through decades of Tai Chi practice and daily walks. When she emerged onto the mats, only Pete and a couple of early students were there, warming up. Pete nodded in greeting, seeming mildly surprised that she had actually shown up. "Good evening, Martha. Glad you could make it," he gestured to the mats. "We usually start with a light jog to warm up, followed by some basic movements. Feel free to go at your own pace." Martha nodded and joined the small circle of joggers that was forming. Her pace was steady, if not swift. Her breathing controlled as she had learned through years of morning Tai Chi sessions in the park. A few more students filed in, some doing double takes when they spotted her among the group. Tom Wong, the friendly 62-year-old from yesterday, waved as he joined the jog. "You actually signed up. Good for you," he said, falling into step beside her. "Life is too short to just watch," Martha replied, drawing a laugh from Tom. As the class filled up, Martha noticed the black belt from yesterday entering with two friends, all of them moving with the casual confidence of experienced practitioners. He glanced her way, eyebrows rising in apparent surprise before he smirked and leaned over to whisper something to his companions. All three looked her way and chuckled. Pete called the class to order after the warm-up. "Today we're covering one of the fundamental movements in Jiu-Jitsu, the hip escape, also called shrimping." He demonstrated the movement, lying on his back and pushing with one foot while his hips moved away. "This is how you create space when someone is on top of you. We'll practice this, then move on to a simple sweep from guard position." The class spread out to practice. Martha found a spot at the edge of the mat, away from the more energetic young men in the center. She lay on her back and began the movement, her body remembering something similar from her judo days. The motion wasn't exactly the same, but the principle of creating space felt natural. Pete walked around, correcting students. When he reached Martha, he watched for a moment before nodding. "Not bad. Try to push more with your foot to get a bigger movement." He demonstrated again beside her, and Martha adjusted her technique. "That's it," Pete said, seeming genuinely pleased. "Good hip movement." From across the mat came a not-quite whispered comment. "Bet that's the first time she's moved her hips in decades." Heat rose to Martha's cheeks, but she kept her expression neutral, continuing the drill with focused precision. Pete shot a sharp look toward the source, the black belt, whose name she would later learn was Brendan Walsh. Pete didn't say anything, however, just moved on to help another student. When they partnered up for the next drill, Martha found herself without a partner as everyone quickly paired off. Tom was already working with someone from his regular class. After an awkward moment, Pete stepped in. "I'll work with you for this one," he said. "First, I'll show you the basic guard position." Martha lay on her back as instructed, while Pete knelt between her legs, showing her how to place her feet on his hips and hold his sleeves. The position felt vulnerable but also strangely powerful, as Pete explained how the guard player could control the opponent, despite being underneath. "Now we'll practice a basic sweep," Pete continued. "When I lean forward, you'll pull this sleeve, push with your foot on the opposite hip, and roll me over." Martha nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly in concentration. This was similar to a move she had known well once, though the grips were different. When Pete leaned forward, Martha executed the sweep, perhaps a bit too well. Pete found himself rolled completely over, a look of surprise flashing across his face as he landed on his back with Martha coming up into the proper position. "Whoa," Pete said, getting back to his knees. "That was actually perfect. Let's try again, but maybe with a little less enthusiasm." A few nearby students had paused to watch, their expressions a mixture of surprise and amusement. Brendan, working with one of his friends across the mat, glanced over with narrowed eyes. "Beginner's luck," someone muttered. For the rest of the class, Martha worked diligently, absorbing the techniques with a focus that belied her age. Her movements weren't fast, but they were deliberate and often technically sound in a way that confused Pete. When they practiced a simple collar choke from guard, her grip placement was immediately correct without much instruction. After class, while most students chatted and slowly gathered their things, Martha quietly wiped her face with a small towel. The exertion had been considerable, more than her body had experienced in years, and her muscles trembled slightly with fatigue. Still, there was a spark in her eyes that had been missing since her husband's funeral. Pete approached as she was preparing to leave. "You did well today, Martha, especially for a first class." "Thank you," she replied simply. "Some of the movements seemed familiar to you?" It was half statement, half question. Martha hesitated. "Some principles are similar to Tai Chi. The balance, the leverage." Pete nodded, though he seemed unconvinced. "Well, whatever it is, you've got good instincts. Just be careful not to push too hard too fast. Jiu-Jitsu can be rough on the body." As Martha was leaving, she overheard Brendan talking to his training partners near the water fountain. "Did you see Coach babysitting the old lady? That's what we're paying membership for now, to make room for people who should be in retirement homes." His friend laughed. "Maybe we should start a senior citizens class. Extra soft mats and oxygen tanks on standby." Martha walked past them, her face impassive, though her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She had faced worse in her life. The whispers when she first arrived in America barely speaking English. The dismissal when she applied for jobs with her foreign education. The patronizing tones of younger managers as she aged. This was nothing new. That night her body ached in ways it hadn't in decades. Martha ran a hot bath with Epsom salts, something her husband had always done after his weekend tennis matches. As she soaked, she flexed her fingers, feeling the familiar strain in her forearms from gripping the GI. It brought back flashes of her youth, the rigorous training sessions in Taipei, her coach's stern voice pushing her to perfect her techniques. After her bath, Martha cleared a space in her modest living room, pushing the coffee table aside. Standing barefoot on the carpet, she began to move through the foundational movements she had learned today, her body remembering more with each repetition: the hip escape, the guard position, the sweep, her muscles reawakening to a language they had once known fluently. On her nightstand sat a faded photograph. Martha at 20, standing proudly on a judo podium, a gold medal around her neck. Beside it was a more recent photo of her with her husband on their 40th anniversary. She touched both pictures gently before turning out the light. For the next 3 weeks, Martha attended classes religiously, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. She arrived early, left late, and practiced at home in between. Her body protested at first with joints stiffening and muscles burning, but gradually began to adapt. The muscle memory from her judo days slowly returned, though she was careful not to display too much knowledge too quickly. Some of the students began to warm to her presence. Tom became a regular training partner, their shared experience as older practitioners creating a natural bond. A few of the younger students, initially skeptical, found themselves impressed by her dedication and unexpected technical insights. "How did you know to adjust your grip like that?" a young woman named Lily asked one day after Martha had helped her with a choke that had been giving her trouble. Martha smiled. "Sometimes smaller hands need different angles," she said simply, not mentioning the years she had spent refining such details on the judo mats of her youth. Brendan and his friends, however, remained openly dismissive. They referred to her as Grandma when talking amongst themselves, loud enough for others to hear. When the class separated for sparring sessions, they made sure to be on the opposite side of the mat from her, as if her presence somehow diminished their training. Pete noticed the division forming in his class but said nothing. He was intrigued by Martha's progress, noting how quickly she absorbed techniques that typically took beginners months to grasp. Still, he held back from pushing her too hard, concerned about injury. "You're doing great, Martha," he told her after a particularly good class where she had executed a perfect pendulum sweep against Tom. "But remember, there's no rush. Jiu-Jitsu is a marathon, not a sprint." Martha nodded respectfully, though in her mind at 72 she wasn't sure how many marathons she had left. Each class was precious, each technique a treasure to be stored and refined. The fire that had once burned in her as a young competitor had rekindled, warming parts of her spirit that had grown cold in the quiet months since becoming a widow. What neither Pete nor the other students realized was that Martha was holding back, watching, learning the specific style and expectations of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu before revealing too much of what she knew. In her tiny apartment each night, she drilled movements with increasing confidence, her body remembering what her mind had filed away decades ago. 1 month into her training, Martha arrived at the academy to find a different energy in the air. Students were stretching with more intensity, and several unfamiliar faces were warming up on the mats. In-house tournament this weekend, Tom explained when he noticed Martha's questioning look. Happens every 3 months, nothing major, just friendly competition between members. He nodded toward a paper sign-up sheet on the wall. Different brackets based on belt level and weight. You thinking of joining? Martha watched as Brendan and his friends wrote their names with flourish, laughing about the easy medals they expected to win. She shook her head. I don't think I'm ready for that yet. Pete called the class to order, and they began the warm-up routine that Martha now knew by heart. Her body moved with growing confidence through the jogging, shrimping, and forward rolls. The initial soreness that had plagued her after each class had gradually subsided, replaced by a pleasant familiarity with the movements. Today we're going to work on escaping side control, Pete announced. This is one of the most common positions you'll find yourself in, especially as beginners. Martha paired up with Lily, the blue belt who worked the front desk. Over the weeks, Lily had taken a quiet interest in Martha, often offering small adjustments to her technique during partner drills. You bridge up first, Lily explained as she settled her weight across Martha's chest in the side control position. Then shrimp away and bring your knee in to create space. Martha nodded, feeling the weight of the younger woman pressing her into the mat. She took a deep breath, bridged her hips up strongly, and executed the escape with surprising efficiency, sliding her knee in exactly as instructed. Lily found herself being moved aside with such smooth timing that she barely had time to resist. Wow, Lily said, genuine surprise in her voice. That was really good. Let's try again, but this time I'll resist more. Across the mat, Brendan was demonstrating something to one of his training partners, his voice carrying over the general murmur of the class. The old lady is still coming? I thought for sure she'd have broken a hip by now. Martha pretended not to hear as she reset under Lily's side control. This time, Lily applied more pressure, using her youth and strength advantage. Martha felt the increased resistance but adjusted instinctively. Instead of forcing the same movement against greater strength, she slightly changed the angle of her bridge, using Lily's pressure against her, a principle deeply ingrained from her judo days. Again, the escape worked smoothly. Lily sat back on her heels, head tilted thoughtfully. Where did you learn that variation? Pete didn't teach that. Martha hesitated. It felt natural to move that way. Well, it's really good, Lily said. Almost like you've done this before. After class, Pete approached Martha while she was gathering her things. You're making impressive progress, he said, his initial skepticism now replaced with genuine curiosity. Some of your movements don't look like a beginner's. Martha tightened the belt of her GI, buying a moment to consider her response. I watch a lot of videos online. To practice at home. Pete nodded slowly. The tournament this weekend, have you thought about participating? The beginners division is very relaxed. It might be a good experience. I don't think I'm ready, Martha said, the same answer she'd given Tom. Well, consider it, no pressure. Pete handed her a tournament flyer before moving on to speak with other students. Martha tucked the flyer into her bag without looking at it. On her way out, she passed Brendan and 2 of his training partners huddled by the water fountain. Hey, Grandma, Brendan called out loud enough for nearby students to hear. Signing up for the tournament? Martha paused, her hand on the door. Not this time, she said politely. Smart choice, Brendan laughed. We wouldn't want to call an ambulance. Though I hear the retirement home is right next to the hospital, so at least you'd be close to home. His friends snickered. A few other students looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Martha felt a flash of heat rise to her face. Not embarrassment, but a flicker of the competitive fire that had once driven her to stand on podiums. She pushed it down and left without another word. That night in her apartment, Martha opened a dusty box she kept in the back of her closet. Inside, wrapped in an old cloth, was her judo medal collection. A dozen or so awards from local and regional competitions in Taiwan, and one national championship gold from 1972. She ran her fingers over the tarnished medal, remembering. Next to the medals was a faded black and white photograph of a young Martha with her judo sensei, both in crisp judogi, her belt marking her as a black belt even then. She had been one of the few female black belts in Taipei at the time, earning it shortly before meeting her husband and moving to America. Martha closed the box and returned it to the closet. Then she cleared her living room space and began to move, flowing through techniques from both her judo past and her jiu-jitsu present, her body remembering more with each session. The next day, Martha arrived early at the academy and found Pete alone, setting up for the morning class. "Pete," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'd like to talk to you about something." Pete looked up from the mats he was arranging. "Of course, Martha. What's on your mind?" Martha took a deep breath. "In my youth, before coming to America, I practiced judo. For many years." Pete's eyebrows rose. "Judo? You competed?" Martha nodded. "Yes, I was. Quite serious about it." She didn't elaborate on her achievements. "I wanted you to know. I didn't mention it before because I wasn't sure if my body would remember after so many years." Pete's expression shifted as pieces fell into place. "That explains a lot. Your understanding of balance, the way you grip." He smiled. "Why tell me now?" "I'm considering the tournament," Martha said. "But I wanted to be honest first." Pete nodded thoughtfully. "I appreciate that, Martha. Judo and Jiu-Jitsu share many principles, as you know. How far did you progress in judo?" Martha hesitated again. "I received my black belt before I left Taiwan." Pete's eyes widened slightly. "You're a black belt in judo? Martha, that's significant experience. Why hide it?" "It was over 50 years ago," she said simply. "And people already look at me strangely here. Being old is enough of a curiosity without adding to it." Pete considered this. "Would you be comfortable if I kept this between us for now? I won't announce it to the class or anything." Martha nodded, relief visible on her face. "Thank you. And yes, I think I would like to participate in the tournament. Beginner division, of course." Pete grinned. "Of course. Welcome aboard." The weekend arrived quickly. The academy was transformed, with the mats rearranged to create a competition area and chairs set up for spectators, mostly friends and family of the competitors. Martha arrived in her clean white GI, her gray hair tied back neatly. She had slept poorly the night before, old pre-competition butterflies returning after decades of dormancy. Tom spotted her and waved her over. "You decided to compete after all. Good for you." Martha smiled nervously. "It seemed like a good experience, like Pete said." "Just have fun with it," Tom advised. "First tournament is always nerve-wracking, but remember, we're all just here to learn and challenge ourselves." The tournament began with the children's divisions, followed by adult white belts. Martha watched carefully, noting the differences between these jiu-jitsu matches and the judo competitions of her youth. There was no standing phase, with most matches beginning from the knees, and the pace was different, slower, more methodical than the explosive movements of judo. When the women's white belt division was called, Martha felt her heart pounding. There were only 4 competitors in her bracket due to her age category: herself, 2 women in their 30s, and a college student. The format was simple. 2 semi-final matches, then the winners would meet in the final. Martha's first opponent was a 35-year-old woman named Diane, a physical therapist who had been training for about 6 months. As they stepped onto the mat, Martha could hear whispers from the spectators, clearly surprised to see someone her age competing. From his spot near the advanced divisions, Brendan nudged his friends and pointed, drawing their attention to Martha. They watched with amused expressions, clearly expecting entertainment at her expense. The referee called Martha and Diane to the center, explained the rules briefly, then signaled for the match to begin. They started from their knees, and Diane immediately attempted to establish grips on Martha's collar and sleeve. Martha felt a lifetime of muscle memory activate. Her hands moved with surprising quickness, establishing her own grips with precision. When Diane tried to pull guard, Martha controlled the movement, allowing her to pull but guiding her to a position slightly off balance. Within 30 seconds, Martha had secured a dominant side position. Her movements weren't particularly fast, but they were efficient and technically sound. Diane struggled underneath, trying to apply the escapes she had learned. But Martha's pressure and positioning were impeccable. When Martha smoothly transitioned to mount position, a murmur went through the small crowd. Pete, watching from the sidelines, tried to keep his expression neutral, but a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Tom, however, openly cheered. With 1 minute left in the match, Martha secured an Americana lock, one of the first submissions taught to white belts. Diane tapped immediately, her face registering shock and a newfound respect. As the referee raised Martha's hand, she caught sight of Brendan and his friends, their amused expressions now replaced with confusion. The whispers around the room had a different tone now, with several people flipping through the tournament program to see who this surprising elderly competitor was. Martha's second match, the final, came after just a 20-minute rest. Her opponent was the college student, a former wrestler with 5 months of Jiu-Jitsu training. Young, strong, and athletic, she had won her semi-final match with aggressive movement and strength. As they faced each other on the mat, Martha could see the girl reassessing her approach, no longer taking her opponent lightly after witnessing the previous match. This time, Martha faced a much more difficult challenge. The young woman used her wrestling background effectively, achieving a takedown and establishing top position early. Martha found herself defending from bottom, using the guard position she had been practicing diligently. For 2 minutes, they battled for position, the younger competitor trying to pass Martha's guard while Martha worked to maintain it or sweep. The crowd was fully engaged now, watching with genuine interest rather than curiosity or amusement. With 1 minute remaining, Martha executed the same sweep she had first practiced with Pete a month ago, but with a level of timing and precision that spoke to years of grappling experience. Her young opponent, caught by surprise, found herself on her back with Martha establishing side control. The match ended with Martha in dominant position, earning her the points for a victory by decision. As the referee again raised her hand, the small crowd applauded enthusiastically. Tom was on his feet, clapping loudly. Even Lily, who wasn't competing, was smiling broadly from the sidelines. Pete approached as Martha stepped off the mat, offering her a bottle of water. "Congratulations. Impressive performance for a beginner," he said quietly, a knowing look in his eyes. Martha accepted the water gratefully. "Thank you. It feels good to compete again, even if my body will hate me tomorrow." News of Martha's tournament performance spread quickly through the academy. By the next class, her status had shifted noticeably. Students who had previously ignored her now nodded in greeting. A few even approached her before class, asking about her background and experience. "I practiced judo when I was young," Martha explained simply, downplaying the extent of her training. But that was many years ago. Tom nudged her playfully as they warmed up. "You've been holding out on us. Those weren't beginner moves you were using." Martha smiled but said little. The attention made her uncomfortable. She had always preferred to let her actions speak for her. On the other side of the mat, Brendan and his training partners were watching her with narrowed eyes. Their previously open mockery had been replaced with something closer to suspicion. "Probably just got lucky," Brendan said, loud enough to be heard. "White belt tournament doesn't mean anything anyway." Pete called the class to order before any further comments could be made. "Today we're working on the Kimura from closed guard," he announced. "It's a powerful submission that works at all levels." He demonstrated the technique with Lily as his partner, showing how to trap the arm and apply the shoulder lock. As the class paired up to practice, Martha found herself approached by several younger students who suddenly wanted to work with her. She partnered with a young man named Raj, who had joined the academy around the same time she had. "I watched your matches," Raj said as they took positions. Martha on her back in guard position with Raj kneeling between her legs. That was really impressive. Where did you learn to move like that? Practice, Martha said simply, then changed the subject. Should I start the drill or would you like to go first? Across the room, Brendan was working with one of his regular partners but kept glancing over at Martha with undisguised irritation. When the class rotated partners for the next round, he deliberately positioned himself near her. Hey, Pete, Brendan called out. Don't you think we should have a demonstration of the technique with our tournament champion? Since she's clearly sandbagging the white belt division, a hush fell over the room. Pete looked up, his expression carefully neutral. Martha is still learning the Jiu-Jitsu curriculum like everyone else, Brendan. Really? Because it looked to me like she knows exactly what she's doing. Brendan's tone was challenging. I'm just saying, if she's going to compete against beginners, maybe we should see what she's really capable of. Martha stood quietly, her hands folded in front of her. She could feel the eyes of the entire class on her, the atmosphere suddenly tense. Pete sighed. Martha, would you be comfortable demonstrating the technique we're working on today? You don't have to if you don't want to. Martha nodded once, if it would be helpful to the class. Her voice was calm, betraying none of the quickened heartbeat she felt. Great, Pete said. Who would you like as a partner for the demonstration? Before Martha could answer, Brendan stepped forward. I'll volunteer. His smile didn't reach his eyes. If that's okay with Grandma. Pete looked like he might object, but Martha spoke first. That would be fine. They moved to the center of the mat where Pete had been demonstrating earlier. The class formed a circle around them, an unusual silence settling over the normally chatty group. Tom caught Martha's eye and gave her a concerned look, which she acknowledged with a small nod. Martha will demonstrate the Kimura from closed guard, Pete announced. Brendan, please start in her guard. Brendan knelt and Martha took her position on the mat, bringing her legs up to wrap around his waist in the closed guard position. The difference in their size was striking. Brendan was at least 6 inches taller and probably 80 pounds heavier, his black belt marking his years of advanced training. Ready? Pete asked. Both nodded. Martha could feel Brendan's energy, tense, almost eager. This wasn't just a demonstration to him. It was a chance to put her in her place. Begin, Pete said. Brendan immediately pressed forward, putting heavy pressure on Martha's upper body, significantly more aggressive than was needed for a technical demonstration. Martha adjusted, using her guard to control his posture and create space. Martha, whenever you're ready, set up the Kimura, Pete prompted. Martha began the sequence they had just learned, gripping Brendan's right wrist and attempting to control his arm. Brendan, however, was not playing the cooperative partner typically expected in a demonstration. He resisted strongly, using his considerable strength advantage. Pete frowned. Brendan, ease up a bit. This is a demonstration, not a competition. Just being realistic, Brendan replied, not taking his eyes off Martha. In a real role, nothing comes easy. Martha felt the familiar calm of competition settling over her. She'd faced stronger opponents before, though admittedly not for many decades. Rather than continuing to force the technique against superior strength, she switched strategies. With a subtle shift of her hips and a precise adjustment of her grips, movements that spoke to years of refined technique, Martha executed a textbook pendulum sweep. Brendan, focused on preventing the Kimura and not expecting the sudden change in tactics, found himself falling to the side. The sweep was so smooth that Brendan barely had time to react. In a moment, their positions were reversed, with Martha establishing side control on top. A murmur of surprise ran through the watching students. Brendan's face flushed red. He immediately tried to bridge and escape, using explosive movement fueled by both strength and wounded pride. Martha, however, floated with his movement, maintaining her position with the weight distribution and base that had won her tournaments in her youth. Let's reset, Pete said quickly, stepping closer to intervene. That was a nice sweep, Martha. Now let's go back to the original technique. No, let's continue, Brendan interrupted, his voice tight. I want to see what else Grandma has been hiding. Before Pete could object, Brendan had already initiated another escape attempt. Martha, responding instinctively to his movement, transitioned smoothly to north-south position, then to knee-on belly, a controlling position that caused Brendan to grimace as she applied precise pressure. The class watched in stunned silence. What had started as a simple technique demonstration had transformed into something else entirely, a public challenge that no one, least of all Brendan, had expected to go this way. Pete stepped forward again. That's enough, but Brendan was already moving, his pride now fully engaged. He managed to create space and was attempting to regain the top position, using his strength and athleticism in a way that would have overwhelmed most opponents his own size, let alone a woman in her 70s. Martha, however, was drawing on decades of ingrained techniques. Where Brendan used power, she used timing. Where he applied pressure, she created angles. Her movements had a fluidity that spoke to thousands of hours on the mat, hours that had been dormant but not forgotten. When Brendan overcommitted to a movement, Martha capitalized immediately. Her hands found his sleeve and collar with practiced precision, and she executed a perfectly timed arm drag that left him off balance. In the space of 2 seconds, she had taken his back, widely considered the most dominant position in Jiu-Jitsu. A few students gasped. Tom let out a low whistle. Even Pete stood speechless for a moment. Martha established her hooks, placing her feet between Brendan's thighs to control his hips, and secured a seatbelt grip around his upper body. The position was textbook perfect, as though it might be photographed for an instructional manual. Brendan struggled briefly, then went still, the fight suddenly gone from his body. The reality of the situation seemed to dawn on him all at once. He, a black belt with years of training and competition experience, was being thoroughly controlled by a 72-year-old woman whom he had been mocking for weeks. "I think we've seen enough," Pete said, finding his voice. "Thank you for the demonstration, both of you." Martha released her grips immediately and moved back, ever respectful of the tap or verbal submission rule that governed all sparring. She rose to her feet with the careful movement of someone her age, but showed no signs of the exertion the exchange had required. Brendan got up more slowly, his face a complex mixture of emotions, embarrassment, confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of respect. He adjusted his GI and belt without meeting anyone's eyes. "That wasn't the Kimura from guard we were working on," Pete said to the class, attempting to bring the session back to its intended focus. But it was an excellent display of how one technique can lead to another depending on your opponent's reactions. "Thank you, Martha." The class resumed with a subdued energy. Students paired up again to practice the original technique, but the dynamic had shifted. Glances kept finding their way to Martha, who had returned to practicing with Raj as though nothing unusual had happened. When the rotation brought Lily to work with Martha, the young woman couldn't contain her curiosity. "Where did you learn to move like that?" "That wasn't just judo." Martha adjusted her GI. "I've been watching videos online," she said, repeating her usual explanation, though it was clear Lily didn't believe it anymore. "And I used to compete. A long time ago." "Well, whatever it was," Lily said, lowering her voice. "Watching you handle Brendan like that was the highlight of my year. He's been insufferable ever since he got his black belt." After class, as Martha was gathering her things, Pete approached her. "Got a minute?" Martha nodded, and they moved to a quiet corner of the gym. "That was quite a demonstration," Pete said, "considerably more than the basic judo experience you mentioned." Martha looked down briefly, then met his eyes. "I may have understated my background a little." "A little?" Pete raised an eyebrow. "Martha, those weren't the movements of someone who used to do judo. Those were the movements of a high-level practitioner." Martha sighed. "I was a national champion in Taiwan. Before I came to America, I trained 6 days a week from age 8 to 23. Pete's eyes widened. "A national champion? Martha, why didn't you say something?" "Would it have made a difference?" she asked quietly. "When I walked in that first day, would you have seen a national champion or just an old woman who might hurt herself?" Pete had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "Point taken. But still, what you showed today was impressive by any standard. Those weren't just judo techniques either." "I've been studying," Martha admitted, "learning the differences, adapting what I know. My body remembers more than I expected." Pete nodded thoughtfully. "Well, I think we need to reevaluate your training program. You shouldn't be drilling basic white belt techniques anymore." Martha shook her head. "I'm still learning jiu-jitsu." "There are many differences from judo. I'd prefer to continue with the regular classes." "At least let me move you to some of the advanced classes," Pete insisted, "where you can be appropriately challenged." As they discussed the details, Martha noticed Brendan lingering near the water fountain, clearly within earshot. His usual training partners had already left, and for once he seemed unsure of himself. When she finished talking with Pete and headed for the door, Brendan finally approached her. His usual cockiness was noticeably absent. "Hey," he said awkwardly. "That was impressive today." Martha nodded once, accepting the closest thing to an apology she was likely to get. "If you don't mind me asking," Brendan continued, "how long did you actually compete?" 15 years, Martha replied simply. "But that was a long time ago." Brendan nodded, processing this information. "Well, if you ever want to? I mean, if you'd like to train sometime?" Martha smiled slightly. "Thank you. Perhaps sometime." She left him standing there, still struggling to reconcile the woman he'd been mocking with the skilled practitioner who had just humbled him in front of the entire academy. Some lessons, Martha reflected as she stepped out into the evening air, took longer to learn than others. But they tended to stick better when they came with a healthy dose of humility. Word of Martha's demonstration against Brendan spread through the Jiu-Jitsu community like wildfire. Within days, students from other academies were dropping in, ostensibly to train but really to catch a glimpse of the elderly woman who had controlled a black belt with such apparent ease. Martha found the attention uncomfortable. She had never sought the spotlight, even in her competition days. When younger students approached her with questions or requests for advice, she answered politely but briefly, redirecting them to Pete whenever possible. "You're going to have to get used to it," Tom told her as they stretched before class one evening. "You've become something of a local legend." Martha shook her head. "I just want to train in peace." "Too late for that," Tom chuckled. "Pete told me 3 people called yesterday asking if the judo grandma was teaching classes yet." Martha winced at the nickname. "I hope he told them no." "Actually," Pete's voice came from behind them, "I told them you might consider a special workshop someday if enough people were interested." Martha turned to him with a look of horror. "You didn't." Pete held up his hands defensively. "Just floating the idea. No pressure." His expression grew more serious. "But Martha, you have something valuable to share. Experience that could benefit a lot of people." "I came here to learn, not to teach," Martha replied firmly. Pete nodded, respecting her decision. "Fair enough. Just know the offer stands if you ever change your mind." As the academy settled into its pre-class routine, Martha noticed Brendan enter. He had been notably subdued since their encounter, training quietly and keeping to himself, a dramatic change from his previous behavior. Today, however, he seemed particularly thoughtful, almost hesitant as he prepared for class. Pete called everyone to line up, and they began the usual warm-up drills. Martha moved through the exercises with the fluid efficiency that now surprised no one. Her body had adapted remarkably over the past 2 months, reclaiming much of the mobility and coordination of her younger years, though she was careful not to push too hard or too fast. "Today we're going to try something a little different," Pete announced as the warm-up concluded. "I want to talk about cross-training and how techniques from different martial arts can complement each other." Martha felt a slight tightness in her chest, sensing where this might be heading. "Many of you know that Martha has an extensive background in judo," Pete continued, confirming her suspicion. "She has graciously agreed to show us a few techniques that translate well to jiu-jitsu." Martha had agreed to no such thing, but the expectant faces turned toward her made it impossible to refuse now. She stepped forward with a small sigh. "In judo," she began, her voice stronger than she expected, "we practice many throws from standing position, but the principles of balance and leverage are the same as in jiu-jitsu." She motioned to Pete, who joined her in the center of the mat. They squared off in standard grips, Martha holding Pete's sleeve and lapel, Pete doing the same to her. Even with a much larger opponent, Martha explained, proper technique allows for efficient movement. She demonstrated a basic foot sweep, moving with surprising quickness for someone her age. Pete, though prepared, found himself briefly off balance before recovering. "The goal is to use your opponent's movement and energy, not to fight against it," Martha continued. She demonstrated again, this time allowing Pete to push forward slightly before executing the sweep with such perfect timing that he had to tap into his black belt level skills to avoid being thrown. The class watched with rapt attention as Martha walked them through 3 basic judo throws and their potential applications in jiu-jitsu. Her explanations were concise but clear, her demonstrations precise despite the physical demands. Decades of experience had made these movements as natural to her as walking. When Pete asked for volunteers to practice the techniques, nearly every hand went up. Martha spent the next 30 minutes moving around the room, making small adjustments to grips and foot positions, offering quiet encouragement where needed. To her surprise, Brendan approached her as she was helping a newer student. "Would you mind showing me that last throw again?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual cockiness. "I'm not getting the foot placement right." Martha nodded, slightly taken aback by his humility. Of course. They moved to an open space, and Martha demonstrated the movement slowly, breaking it down into its component parts. Brendan watched intently, his focus entirely on learning rather than competing. "Like this?" he asked, mimicking her movement. "Almost," Martha said. "Your leading foot should be here." She adjusted his stance slightly. "Now try again." Brendan repeated the movement with the correction, achieving much better results. "That makes a difference," he acknowledged. "Thank you." Martha nodded and moved on to help other students, but not before noticing the shift in Brendan's demeanor, a genuine student now rather than a challenger. After class, as students were leaving, Brendan approached Martha again. He seemed to be struggling with something, his usual confidence nowhere to be seen. "Martha," he began, then paused, choosing his words carefully. "I owe you an apology. The way I've been acting, the things I said, they were disrespectful and wrong." Martha regarded him quietly, allowing him space to continue. "I've been training for 8 years, Brendan went on. "Got my black belt last year. I started thinking I knew everything there was to know." He shook his head. "I guess I needed a reminder about what matters in martial arts. Humility is as important as technique," Martha said gently. "My first sensei used to say that," Brendan nodded. "Anyway, I just wanted you to know I'm sorry, and if you'd ever be willing to train together sometime, I'd consider it an honor." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Martha smiled slightly. "I think that could be arranged." As Brendan thanked her and left, Pete approached, having overheard the exchange. "That's quite a transformation," he remarked. "Never thought I'd see Brendan Walsh apologizing to anyone." "People can surprise you," Martha said, "if you give them the chance." Pete nodded thoughtfully. "Speaking of surprises, I got a call today from the organizers of the Regional Open next month. Apparently someone told them about you, and they're very interested in having you compete." Martha's eyebrows shot up. "At my age? That's ridiculous. Actually, they have a senior division," Pete explained. "It's not large, but it exists. And they also have a master's demonstration section for practitioners with exceptional backgrounds." Martha was already shaking her head. "I don't think—" "Before you say no," Pete interrupted, "consider what it might mean to others. There are people who stop training because they think they're too old. Imagine what seeing you on the mat might mean to them." Martha fell silent, considering his words. She thought of how alone she had felt after her husband's passing, how the emptiness of her apartment had seemed to echo with absence, how finding this new community, despite its initial resistance, had given her purpose again. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Pete smiled. "That's all I ask." The following Saturday, Martha arrived at the academy to find it unusually crowded for an open mat session. Pete had mentioned something about a special training day, but hadn't elaborated. As she made her way to the changing room, she noticed several unfamiliar faces among the crowd, including a group of older individuals who seemed out of place among the typically younger practitioners. When she emerged in her GI, Pete waved her over to where he stood with the group of older visitors. "Martha, I'd like you to meet some people," he said. "This is the senior program from Westside Community Center. They've been asking about starting some gentle self-defense classes." An elderly man with a cane stepped forward, extending his hand. "George Miller. I'm 81, and these young folks tell me you're quite the inspiration." Martha shook his hand, shooting Pete a questioning look. "I may have shown them the video," Pete admitted. "Video?" Martha asked, alarm in her voice. Pete looked slightly sheepish. "From the tournament and maybe a little of your demonstration with Brendan. Someone recorded it on their phone. It's gotten quite a few views online." Martha closed her eyes briefly, processing this information. When she opened them, she found herself surrounded by eager faces, men and women in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s looking at her with something approaching awe. "We were hoping," said a silver-haired woman using a walker, "that you might show us a few things. Nothing fancy, just some basics an old body could manage." Martha looked at the group, their hopeful expressions, their bodies showing the same wear and limitations that she battled daily, and something shifted inside her. She recognized in them the same hunger for purpose that had driven her through the academy doors that first day. "I'm not a teacher," she said softly. "Couldn't. Prove it by me," came Brendan's voice as he approached the group. He was dressed to train, his black belt tied neatly around his waist. "I've learned more from you in one session than from some seminars I've paid hundreds for." Martha looked from Brendan to the seniors to Pete, who was watching her with quiet expectation. "Perhaps," she said finally, "we could start with some gentle movement drills. Balance and coordination, the foundation of all good technique." The seniors' faces lit up. Pete quickly arranged a space on the mat for them, bringing chairs for those who needed them. As Martha began guiding the group through basic movements, she found an unexpected ease in the role of instructor. The decades of training under numerous coaches had given her a wealth of knowledge on how to explain complex movements in simple terms. She adapted exercises on the fly, making accommodations for artificial hips and arthritic knees without sacrificing the core principles. To her surprise, Brendan and several other advanced students positioned themselves at the edges of the group, following along respectfully, occasionally helping a senior maintain balance or understand a movement. "See?" Pete said quietly as he passed behind her. "Teaching comes naturally to you." Martha didn't respond, but she couldn't deny the warmth that spread through her as she watched an 80-year-old man successfully execute a simple wrist escape, his face lighting up with the same joy she had felt in her youth when mastering a new technique. By the end of the impromptu session, Martha had reluctantly agreed to lead a weekly class specifically for seniors. As the visitors thanked her and departed, many with a newfound spring in their step, Brendan approached her again. "That was impressive," he said sincerely. "You have a gift for teaching." Martha shook her head modestly. "I just share what I know." "That's what the best teachers do," Brendan replied. "By the way, a bunch of us are going to the Regional Open next month. As competitors and supporters, it would mean a lot if you were there, in whatever capacity." Martha looked around the academy, at Pete working with a group of white belts, at Tom laughing with Lily by the water cooler, at the diverse community that had gradually accepted her and now valued her presence. She thought of the seniors who had looked at her with such hope today, seeing in her what they could still become rather than what time had taken from them. "Perhaps," she said with a small smile, "it's time to come out of retirement."